all my best regards to everyone in Poland, and I very much look forward to being able to visit. And I had an absolutely fabulous time, and I really enjoyed getting to know some Polish teachers. So one reason that I very much enjoy getting to know teachers is that everyone has a story. It seems I always like to ask people how they got into teaching or how they got into publishing for people who work in publishing, and it usually seems to be the accident comes up. So often people have ended up in the teaching profession, not because they decided as a child they wanted to teach English, but because life led them that way. Certainly my own story was a desire to see the world. I studied English literature at university, and it was a series of happy accidents that led me to where I am today. So in a way, I think teachers are a bit like, we could say, like the hero Hercules. They're people who have adventures, people who are kind of out there seeing the world, fighting difficulty, facing different challenges every day. And this picture is certainly how I feel as being a materials developer, and I think how I felt often as a teacher. I don't know if you recognize this creature or not. This is this is Hercules, the hero Hercules, and he, in this picture, is fighting a creature called the hydra. Now Hercules, like teachers, had many adventures. In fact, in Greek history, we're told about 12 different adventures or labors that Hercules had, and this, as it happens, was the second one. Now, this creature Hercules went to fight this creature, and it seemed to Hercules to be a fairly straightforward battle. He took his sword, and he just thought, okay, I need to just chop off these heads. And so that's what he did. He took his sword, and he would cut off a head. And that's how the battle began. But what he realized very soon after he started chopping heads is that every time he chopped a head, 2 heads would grow back in the same place. So this is sort of what it feels like in the work I do as a materials developer. You're going along developing materials, and then somebody says, oh, well, we've got digital learning. You know, what do we do about digital learning? And that's a problem. And then you think, oh, I know, iPads. We get iPads in the classroom. And so you start developing materials for iPads, and every student gets an iPad. And then you suddenly realize that the apps won't download, or that the learners are all using their iPad to go on Facebook instead of study, whatever. So the thing that was a solution, cutting off the head, actually turns into multiple problems. So it sort of feels that our problems are always multiplying. And the more we work and the more we do battle, the more heads sprout. So that's kind of the image of this talk, is we as teachers and materials developers doing battle with the many-headed hydra. Just when you think you've solved a problem, you have 2 new ones. Okay, here we go. So, this is Hercules doing battle with the hydra. A question that's come up for me in materials development is this question of what variety of English to 21st century learners need. 15 years ago, materials were always either British English or American English. Generally, that was the case. So different countries preferred either British English or American English. Then 10 or so years ago, we started talking about international English, or some people call it internet English, global English, we could say, and it's sort of maybe an American flavor. It's the kind of language that you see on Wikipedia or on the internet. And so that started getting introduced into teaching materials. So we would have like a British flag and an American flag saying British people say lorry and American people say truck. And we kind of started raising awareness about international English and about the fact that there were all these varieties. Well, what we have now is a situation where English is a lingua franca. So, looking at some numbers here, we have up to 2 billion English speakers globally. 2 billion people speak English globally. There's a population now of about 7.5 billion, 7.3 billion people in the world. Of those 2 billion, an estimated 375 to 450 million speakers are native English speakers. They're from the US, Australia, Canada, and we'll look at some others. So those are the native speakers of English. But an estimated 900 million to 1.5 billion speakers of English are non-native speakers. So you can see from the chart that there are a lot more non-native speakers. And it's estimated that in the next 10 years, there'll be another 2 billion new learners of English. So the numbers show something very interesting. The numbers show that English is used a lot more by people who are not native speakers. Another interesting bit of information here. It's estimated that about 3/4 of the conversations that take place in English in the world are between non-native speakers. So 74% is the exact figure. I'm not sure why that's not 75%. It seems very exact. But 74% of English interactions are between a non-native speaker and a non-native speaker. In other words, there's no native speaker present. So again, we can see that this issue of American English or British English, we can start to ask the question whether that is such a relevant consideration. Going on with this idea, in the 1970s, there was a researcher at University of Indiana, I believe, Indiana or Illinois, Braj Kachru. He was from India originally, and he was a sociolinguistics researcher. He was the person who started talking about world Englishes rather than just English or varieties of English, world Englishes. So Indian English, South African English, American English, British English. And he came up with this idea of 3 circles. And at the time, he was concerned with sort of the status or the importance of language. And in his circle model, the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia were kind of at the center of the target. These were the languages that people wanted to learn. So if you were going from Poland to study English abroad, or you were studying in Poland, chances are you would say that you were learning American English or British English, one or the other. But outside of that, interestingly, we've got these countries like India, the Philippines, Singapore, Nigeria, South Africa, and other countries where English is official language or a language that is learned natively at home. So it's an important language in the culture, but crucially, you wouldn't generally find people going from Poland to the Philippines to study English, or from Japan to South Africa to study English. So in some ways, these were not seen as being full varieties of English. Now, I'm not saying that, and Kachru wasn't saying that, but he was talking about their status in the world. So these are sort of the second tier of English. And then outside of that, we have the rest of the world, which is all the people who are using English for business or English for trade purposes. So language learners in the rest of the world. And they're kind of out on the outer edge. They're not so important in this model. So move forward into 2015, and the world looks a little bit different. English is a lingua franca. I guess, as you know, a lingua franca is a language that is used for business or for trade or for people to conduct business in a language that they both speak, but that is neither of their native languages. So now we could say, because of the numbers I showed you before, that the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia are way at the outside of the circle because they're the fewest number of speakers. Then in the middle, we still have India and those other places where English is used natively. But we could make a case for English as a lingua franca being at the center of the target, because most people who speak English are speaking as non-native speakers to other non-native speakers, and that puts it at the center of the target. Okay, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to read this, and I need to step away from the screen. I do apologize. Read this quotation. Okay, sorry about that. So, in my opinion, English as a lingua franca has two meanings. The first meaning just describes the fact of the way English is used, the way I described earlier. It's the fact that it's a trade language, and there have been other lingua francas in the history of the world. And that's just a fact. It's a fact that people use English non-natively to interact with other non-natives. There's also, as you can see from this quotation, kind of a movement in linguistics that calls itself English as a lingua franca. And this movement has, the main thing that characterizes the movement, as this quotation says, is that English as a lingua franca is actually a specific variety of English that's like Australian English or British English or American English that has equal importance and, as you'll see, kind of its own grammar. So let's take a look at that. Some interesting facts about English as a lingua franca that these researchers describe. Many ELF variations follow natural patterns of English. So where English as a lingua franca is different from a native English variety, it often follows grammatical patterns of its own. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. Looks like we're having a slight delay on the slide loading here.
Hi there, Lewis. It's Charlie.
Hi.
Your technical angel. I can, if you're having a problem moving the slides forward, I can move them forward for you.
Okay, if you could move the next one, that would be fantastic. And I'm going to check one thing at this end as well. Okay, sorry, a bit chaotic. So Charlie, can you mute your mic now?
Next one.
Charlie, we're getting an echo off your mic. Okay. Good. So, also with English as a lingua franca speakers, it's often the case that they choose an incorrect variety in certain situations. So, if you're familiar with code switching, we might have people in Singapore who speak a type of English called Singlish or Singapore English, who can speak perfectly clear and what we would call correct native-like English, but in certain social situations, they will choose what we would call an incorrect form of English that has to do with being part of a social group. Perhaps the most important thing about English as a lingua franca is that if you imagine you have a Polish person and a Spanish person and a Chinese person all interacting together, then you've got Polish culture and Chinese culture and Spanish culture, but no English culture present there. So in some ways, where we would normally associate certain uses of English with certain cultures, when there's no native culture there, then a lot of questions about politeness and how language can be used socially are thrown up in the air. Here's a good example. I'm originally from the US. I spent the first half of my life in the US and more or less the second half of my life in the UK. In the US, if I'm walking down the street and I walk near someone on the pavement, on the sidewalk, chances are I won't say anything. In the UK, if you walk near someone on the pavement or on the sidewalk, chances are a British person will say, "Oh, sorry," and that will be seen as polite because British people have a more highly developed sense of personal space. So if you walk near someone, you use language in a certain way. Now, if we've got our Chinese and our Pole and our Spaniard all in one group, do they use American politeness or British politeness if they're speaking English, or Spanish politeness or Polish politeness or Chinese politeness? And how do they know? How do they know which one to use? I don't have an answer to that. But as we'll see a little later on, an important consideration from a teaching standpoint is this whole issue of what's happening socially with language in these mixed groups. And connected to this is the idea that native speakers cannot necessarily do English as a lingua franca. You might assume that if I join the group of as a native English speaker, the Polish person, the Chinese person, and the Spanish speaker, if I join that group, you might assume that I have an advantage as the native English speaker. But I don't. It's not necessarily the case that I will be the most successful communicator in an English as a lingua franca situation. Often people from different language groups develop their own habits of speech and their own ways of communicating that are not obvious to native English speakers. In some cases, it may be quite more simple forms are chosen or whatever. I might have difficulty making myself understood when everyone else makes themselves understood. So that's some interesting facts about English as a lingua franca. Some examples. The TH sound, th, theta, and eth in English, like as in the word think, very common in English, less common in a lot of other languages. So we tend to get, instead of think, we get sink or zinc or tink or dink or think. All of those are variations in phonology that we get in EFL. In fact, we get some of those in native English speech as well. Irish people tend to say tink with a T sound instead of think. Some people in certain parts of London say think with an F. So another one that is a feature of English as a lingua franca. Research tells us, second language acquisition research tells us that the third person S, he goes, is very late for learners of all language groups to acquire in English. In other words, it's only very advanced learners of English that have perfected this very simple piece of this very simple verb ending, and that's a fact. It's just a fact of English, and now considered a descriptor of English as a lingua franca, that many English as a lingua franca users say he goes to school every day, even when they're relatively advanced in their English. Another example, grammatically, is that tag questions are often reduced to isn't it. The system of tag questions grammatically in English is relatively complex. I should go, shouldn't I? So that is often reduced to just isn't it in English as a lingua franca. I should go now, isn't it? Or you borrowed my car yesterday, didn't? Isn't it? So isn't it is also very common in English as a lingua franca. So people who describe English as a lingua franca as a variety in its own right, this is what they're talking about. I'd like to look at implications. In my opinion, this does not mean that we should teach simplified English. Just because people don't acquire the verb ending in the third person singular doesn't mean we stop teaching it. I think we continue to teach it, but we just need to be aware of it. For me, the most important thing about English as a lingua franca is educating our learners to the idea that the culture that they will create in their interactions with other non-native speakers will require a certain amount of negotiation. They have to, when you've got your Polish person, your Chinese person, and your Spanish person, they need to extend some extra effort to establish principles of politeness and just to understand that although they share a common language, English, there is no culture attached to that language. So there's some work for learners to do to understand this shared culture that they've created. We also understand, and this is something that I've definitely learned through materials development, that the materials that we use nowadays are less and less preparing people to go to America or preparing people to go to the UK or preparing people to go to Australia. It used to be that the course book had pictures of the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building, or it had pictures of Big Ben and red post boxes and double-decker buses. But now the cultural target is not so obvious. So we need to use materials that prepare learners to interact with other non-native speakers. And I'll look at some examples of that shortly. Okay, so my question was, what variety of English to 21st century learners need? And my answer to that question was English is a lingua franca. We need to prepare learners to use this to work in this English as a lingua franca context. So we've slashed the head off, right? However, as we know from the story of the hydra, where we cut off one head, two heads emerge. So a question that arises now, okay, so we've got this global variety of English, but what about learners' individual needs? So the world is changing. The European Commission has mandated or has ruled that in order to make all of Europe better at languages, learners need to start younger. There are official programs now in schools across Europe in CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning, where learners are learning not only their subject area, but also a foreign language at the same time. Not always English. We also have an increasing amount of EAP and English for academic purposes, and also English for specific purposes, ESP. So 10 years ago, we had a few ESP books. In my time working in ESP, I've seen the rise of English for football, English for the fashion industry, English for cabin crew has become more common. We're getting more and more published materials with all kinds of different specialities. And so it starts to feel as though I'm having a slide issue again. Charlie, if you can move the slide on, if that's possible. We've got all of these learners with all these specific needs, and this is you as the teacher. So there you are as Hercules again, and you've got You go to your classes and some of your students are doing EAP, some are trying to go into engineering. Maybe you're asked to cover a class for a colleague who teaches another subject, and you think, I don't understand technical English, how can I possibly teach? And so we're back to this image of feeling like Hercules fighting the many-headed hydra. Okay. I'm thinking of a specific job. And this specific job requires these functions. Take a minute and read the functions. And it also requires this grammar and vocabulary. If you feel like it, type in any guesses that you might have about what specific job I might be thinking of. You can type them in the dialog window. What job could be described by these functions and this grammar and vocabulary? Who needs this language? Definitely a teacher, yep. Policeman could be, although that's not the one I'm thinking of. Yep, teacher, salesman, manager. Okay, yep, keep going, keep going. Okay, I am thinking of a specific job, and none of those are the one that I'm thinking of. This is the one I'm thinking of. However, all of you were correct. So, in ESP in particular, we get very, very focused in on doing these needs analyses, very detailed needs analyses. And I'm not saying that we should give up needs analysis, but I think we can make an argument that there's a certain type of English that most people need. There's certain language that everyone needs. Let's take a closer look at that. So these are the functions I was thinking of. These are the jobs I mentioned before. But let's look a little closer. So what we have the many-headed hydra with all these heads, but the body of the hydra is one body. So we've got English for all of these different purposes, but English is at the heart of it all. So all of the heads connect back to a type of English. Let's take a closer look at that. So we've got what we used to call General English, or I think the technical term is ENPP, and that stands for English for no particular purpose. Then we've also got ESP, all of those ones that I named before. And then EAP and content and language integrated learning. And they all kind of overlap. But what we have in the middle, yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? What we have in the middle is this, what I would like to call generic English. And this generic English is like the body of the many-headed hydra. So we've got all of these different types of specific English, but then in the body we have generic English. So if we can go for another image, this is what I call the ESP pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid we have technical English. This is the English that fills teachers with fear. So if you know anything about welding, then you'll understand the meaning of this sentence I've put there. If you don't know anything about metal work or welding, then it makes no sense to you. And this is what frightens teachers. But what we have underneath that is this sentence: the melting point will vary with the basic nature of the material, iron, steel, aluminum, magnesium, etc. So this language, if you've been to high school, you understand melting point. We can transfer it to the melting point of butter if you're baking, or the melting point of ice if you want to talk about just general science. This is semi-technical language, and what you have to notice is that in the pyramid, there's a little bit of technical language at the top, but in the middle, there's a lot more semi-technical language. And if you're following me, you can see where we're going. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have language like this. We'll start work on this at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And that's the base of the pyramid. That holds everything up. So this is the general enabling language is at the bottom of the pyramid. And this is where you, as a teacher, are the expert. In fact, even with the semi-technical language, you should be reasonably competent as an English teacher. So what this shows us is that what most people need the most is this language at the bottom. And in fact, when you talk to business people or people who work in a job, very often the language that they feel that they need is the language of interaction in the workplace, language around their area of work, not necessarily negotiation skills or hyper technical language. They just want to be able to talk comfortably with other people in their job. Here's another example that's more in English for academic purposes or in the humanities, which also has its technical language. And you can see the bottom one. It's pretty obvious that people change as they grow older and more experienced. That's the conversation you have at the pub on a Friday night or at lunch when you're at work. And then the others are reserved for the classroom. So keep that shape in mind, the pyramid. There's a little bit of technical language at the top that somebody has to master, but your main job as a teacher may well be at the bottom, which is the foundation, which holds everything up. Okay, so I've chopped another head off there. What we need to focus on as teachers is generic English, right? Problem solved. Except another head has grown, so we've now got a total of 4 heads. And 2 more questions arise. What kind of input do learners need? How do I give, especially adults, what kind of input works in the classroom, and what kind of materials can supply that? Okay. This is from research that describes how adults use language in their daily working life. And this isn't just English, this is any language. So you can see that most adults spend the majority of their time listening and speaking. So that would argue that input, a lot of listening input is very important for learners, and that the skills we need to develop are listening and speaking. So I'm a big fan of authentic materials, and this is the definition. My definition of authentic materials would be anything that is not designed as English language teaching material. So it could be newspaper articles, magazine articles. I love TED Talks, which we'll talk about a little later. So TED Talks, any language that you can bring in from the real world. They work well because they feature real language, real content. They always have a real communicative purpose, so you're never in danger of wondering why that text is there. So often in English language teaching materials, you have a text or a paragraph that you cannot imagine a native speaker reading or writing for any real purpose. Using authentic materials also increases learners' confidence with the real world, and generally, if they work well, they provide engagement and inspiration for learners. And they also help learners develop the appropriate skills, as I described in that pie chart. They also help stimulate and model output. So they give us something to talk about, and in many cases, they give us something to copy or something to be like. So if it's a presentation, it becomes a model for giving a presentation. If it's a written text, it becomes a model for producing your own written text. Okay, Jim Scrivener, who wrote a book called Learning Teaching, came up with a model called the ARC model. And this is not the order of how to present things in class, but it's a model for measuring the balance of things in class. So he believed that every class should include some authentic language. And authentic language can be receptive, like a TED talk that you play or an article that you read, or it can be authentic language coming from your students. So when you ask your students to speak in English, the language that comes out of them is authentic, produced English. They've produced English because they're sharing their own ideas. He also thinks that there should be some restricted language, so language that just looks at specific grammar or specific vocabulary, specific lexis. And then Scrivener also says that every lesson should include a clarification stage, which is the teaching stage, basically, where the teacher explains the grammar point or helps with translating the language, or the student discovers that on their own. So that's from Learning Teaching. Again, this isn't an order. We don't do it first authentic, then restricted, then clarification, but Scrivener's idea is that every lesson should include a mixture of these three elements. So everything that you do should be one of these, and if it's not one of these, then it probably doesn't belong in your lesson. Okay, now I'm going to get on to a TED Talk. I'm going to show you the first couple of minutes of the talk. It's a 9-minute talk. We don't have time for the whole thing, but I'll show you the first couple of minutes. And while we're watching it, I'd just like you to think about these questions. Okay, so keep those questions in mind about how you think you might be able to use this as a teacher in the classroom that you work in. And with any luck, I'm going to be able to switch across to this video.
Lewis, could you just turn your microphone off because we're getting a double whammy through your speakers. Thank you, and I'll start it again.
是不同的语言，来源自不同的文化嘛。除了要学习口音和腔调以外，还有是句。
Hi, I'm Heten. I'm an artist, and this is Yu, who is a dancer I've been working with. I have asked her to translate for me.
更重要的是手势特有的习惯和动作。
If I may, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and my artwork.
我们可以透过学习不同的语言，来认识不同的文化嘛。
I was born and raised near Manchester in England, but I'm not going to say it in English to you, as I'm trying to avoid any assumptions that might be made from my northern accent.
除了要学习口音和腔调以外，还有是句，更重要的是手势特有的习惯和动作。
The only problem with masking it with Chinese Mandarin is I can only speak this paragraph, which I have learned by heart when I'm visiting in China. So all I can do is keep repeating it in different tones and hope you won't notice.
更重要的是手势特有的习惯和动作。
Okay, so that's the first part of the talk. The talk continues, and Hiten Patel goes on to discuss questions of identity. His fellow was from India. He grew up in the UK. He talks about accent. He talks about Bruce Lee, the famous kung fu fighter from Hong Kong. He talks about Spider-Man and a series of other kind of issues to do with who he is and the question of copying people or imitating people. It's quite a good talk, and you can watch it on TED.com. So if you you can go to the site and watch the whole talk. What I'd like to do now, so I realize we started a bit late and that time is short, so I'm going to leave you with those questions about how you might use the talk in your classroom, and I'll bring you to the end of the video now.
Okay, so this imitation business does come with risk. Doesn't always go as you plan it, even with a talented translator. But I am going to stick with it because, contrary to what we might usually assume, imitating somebody can reveal something unique. So every time I fail to become more like my father, I become more like myself. Every time I fail to become Bruce Lee, I become more authentically me. This is my art. I strive for authenticity, even if it comes in a shape that we might not usually expect. It's only recently that I've started to understand that I didn't learn to sit like this through being Indian. I learned this from Spider-Man. Thank you.
Business.
Okay. So if we wanted to address English as a lingua franca using that TED Talk, there's clear overt discussion there about culture and language. We've got you use Chinese, English. Hitain Patel himself speaks Chinese and then speaks about his accent. So it's very good for addressing questions of culture and language. As I mentioned, we've got Yu Rao's accent there, and also Hitain Patel's accent. And through the episode, he imitates a number of other UK accents. So it's quite interesting from that perspective. Again, talking about English as a lingua franca, the talk addresses the question of challenging assumptions and things that we assume about people, or things that maybe assumptions that go with language and culture. Okay, if we wanted to use this in a classroom to teach generic English, but in a professional or technical context, Patel talks about his background. So if you've got an engineer, or you've got a business person, or you've got a nurse, or anyone in any kind of technical field or otherwise, people need to talk about their background. This would be great stimulus for that. It's even a good model for output. He talks about his art. He talks about who he is. It's lovely on that topic. He also talks about his work. In this case, he explains his job as an artist. And again, who doesn't need to talk about their work? Even students can talk about their work and their interests. So it's a good model for that. It's also an excellent one for possibly talking about team roles. So I strongly recommend, as soon as this webinar is finished, just Google TED.com or TED Hitain Patel. You can watch the whole talk. It also has English subtitles or Polish subtitles if you're interested, or many other languages as well. So check it out. That one we used in the keynote series at level B1. Some people might find it challenging at B1, but I think if you, with a certain amount of repetition and the correct support, it would work well at B1. So I would say now we've finally chopped off a head. Going back to the story of Hercules, and I'm sorry, I realize we're running slightly over because we started late. I've got 2 or 3 more minutes. Hercules discovered that if he took his sword and put it in the fire and heated it up, he could chop off the head of the hydra, chop off the many heads, and it would burn the wound, and the head wouldn't grow back. So here's what happens when you do that. This is you, the victorious teacher, with your superheated sword, which I would say we could describe as your lessons, which are, we could say, based on the ARC model, which I mentioned before. So as regards the question of which variety of English we teach, well, we need to reflect the real world of English as a lingua franca. We develop lessons that aren't about going to Australia or going to the US or going to the UK, unless our learners are doing that, but we develop lessons that, that deal with the challenges of all of these non-native speakers out there that your learners will encounter and work with. We need to reflect that in our lessons. We also don't lose sight of the fact that we need to constantly be working on this generic language that every learner needs, especially in EAP, especially in ESP. We can really get carried away with the idea that all our learners need is highly technical language. Okay, they need some highly technical language, but to become fully proficient, they also need a huge amount of generic enabling language all the time. And they want to be able to converse like an intelligent adult about their areas of interest. So we provide authentic input. I think TED Talks are a great way of doing this. That's what the keynote series that has just been published is completely driven by that. Everything in there comes from authentic sources. And then this authentic input, it's never good enough just to have authentic input. The authentic input needs to be supported by the clarification stage that we talked about, and the sort of guided, focused, restricted language where we look at just grammar or just vocabulary. So the fully rounded lesson is ARC. Okay, sorry, that was a bit of a sprint. I apologize again for the slightly late start. That is what I have now. If you're interested in keeping in touch with me, I'm on Twitter, so you can follow me there. You can direct message me there. I also have a website if you want to see more about my work, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to connect with teachers on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of thank you on everybody's behalf. I loved the analogy of the many-headed hydra. Took me back to school, and also kind of as a teacher makes you feel super powerful, especially if you can cut off the heads. So thank you very much. We probably do have time for a couple of quick questions, or you can direct them straight to Lewis through any of those ways, or through National Geographic Learning as well. So many thanks from me, and if there are any questions, go ahead.
Gosh, thank you for all of those thanks. Can you mute your mic, Charlie? Thank you. Yeah, my only regret about a webinar is that I can only see myself, and I can see that there were 99 participants, and I really appreciate you showing up and listening. I like doing webinars in a way because it's in the comfort of my own office. It's always more gratifying to be able to see faces in the audience looking back at me. But anyway, I appreciate all the kind comments, and please do get in touch one way or another if you would like to.
Great. I think that's about 99 thanks now that we've had. So if there are no questions, we'll slowly start kind of closing down. We'll be sending the recording on afterwards via Nova Era, our partners in Poland. So again, thank you very much, everybody, and have a lovely evening. Lewis, bye-bye. I'm going to turn myself off now, and we will shut down the webinar room. Bye-bye.